Wolf Cursed by Kate Rudolph. A Guarded by the Shifter novella. Narrated by Maxx Pinkins. Prologue. Julian raced after the werewolf pack, but Nora held back. She was in her wolf form, but she had to think about this like a human. The other wolves were on the edge of running wild. If she didn't keep her faculties, they could all die. This could be a trap. She'd had a bad feeling about this job from the beginning, and now all of her instincts were screaming at her that they'd been right. Those instincts needed to shut up. She had work to do. Her fellow bodyguards were unconscious in the cafeteria, and most of the coven she was here to protect was knocked out right alongside them. The only witch still standing was Julian, and she was struggling against her wolf. Her stupid wolf wanted to grab him and lock him up somewhere to keep him safe. But he wasn't the one in danger. Audra Palmer, the leader of Julian's coven, had been taken by the head of a rival coven. It was going down. It was Nora's job to stop it. When she reached the edge of the clearing, where a fire roared and the evil witch Rosalie Sutton spat her vitriol, Nora kept clear. She'd been right to hold back. Rosalie had hired her own shifter bodyguards, but those men had turned on her, and now she was holding them in place with her magic. The job was getting harder. Julian had joined the fray and was shooting magic as fast as he could summon it. And in the middle of it all was Audra Palmer. Nora stayed in the shadows. She had to time this right. She didn't have magic or a gun, so she couldn't keep her distance and take Sutton out with a well-timed shot. No, she'd have to do this like the wolf she was. Sutton did something with a flash of magic, and Nora knew this was the last moment she had to act. So she didn't think. She charged. There was another flash of magic, and she went flying back, pain searing through her as magic fizzed in her veins and blossomed within her. She fell to the ground, losing her grip on her wolf form and changing back into her human skin, naked under the moonlight. It felt wrong. It was like tar was flowing through her veins, and her head was fuzzy. She reached for her wolf, trying to switch back to that safer form, but she couldn't. The magic hit had been a doozy. It was okay. It had to be okay. Nora shivered in the cool night air and felt eyes on her. She realized that the tide had turned. Rosalie Sutton was unconscious. They'd won. Julian wasn't looking at her. That was fine. He was being polite. Normally, Nora would think it was a good thing that a guy wasn't staring at her tits while she tried to do her job. But her feelings were all in a jumble when it came to Julian, and she couldn't examine them too closely right now. When the job was done, she'd take the time, but not a moment sooner. Nora forced herself back to her feet and nodded like she wasn't in excruciating pain. The sooner they got back to camp, the sooner she could find some clothes. "Any injuries?" one of the wolves, Ro, asked. "All good," his alpha, an older man named Gibson, replied. "That hurt like a motherfucker, but I'm alive." Nora put a bit of bravado into her words. The pain wasn't receding. On the bright side, it wasn't getting worse. She didn't know what evil magic Rosalie's spell had contained, but she hoped it didn't take. And if it did, well, Nora would deal with that later. She just needed this job to be over. Soon. Chapter 1. Rosalie Sutton was one evil witch. Powerful, too. And she was never going to hurt anyone again. Nora rubbed her chest where Rosalie's final, desperate strike had hit her. It had felt like fire and sewage ripping through her body, turning her veins to sludge. And then the pain had evaporated like it had never been there. Everyone was shooting her looks like it was some miracle she'd survived the curse. To Nora, it was just another day on the job. Bodyguard to the magical world, leader of her shifter pack. All around badass, not that she'd ever say that part out loud. You weren't actually a badass if you had to tell people you were. Thankfully, this job from hell was just about over. A handful of witches were watching over the evil Rosalie until the proper magical authorities could arrive to take her to witch prison, or wherever it was misbehaving magic users went, and Nora and her shifter crew, Estelle, Enrique, and Shannon, could all go home to upstate New York and take a well-earned break. She wasn't happy about being lured out here and nearly killed, and she'd be having words with her client when the invoice was filed. But they'd all survived, more or less. She was just going to ignore the pesky magic clinging to her like a bruise. "I can't believe that bitch spelled us." Estelle stood outside their cabins and scowled toward the center of camp, where most of their clients were congregating. She was a pretty woman, pale, shorter than Nora, and curvy. No one would peg her for a bodyguard, or a wolf shifter. Her dark hair was pulled back in a serviceable braid, and she wore dark clothes that hid bloodstains. "I tested that food for drugs. It came up clean." Nora patted Estelle's shoulder, giving it a little squeeze before she pulled away. "We're alive. We'll do better next time. Save your grief for the debrief." Estelle gave her a curious look. "You doing okay? I hear you took a big hit." Nora grunted. "Nothing hurt, really." "I'm fine. I don't need more people worrying about me." "More?" Estelle's green eyes lit up. "Who's worrying about you? The cute witch guy?" She looked back at the clustered witches, trying to pick him out. "Julian's a client." She had to shut this down before Estelle got going. When the woman got her teeth into something, she didn't let it go. And that was true no matter what form she was in. Estelle rolled her eyes. "He's a client until tomorrow. I think you've done all you can to respect professional boundaries." She gave Nora a friendly bump and moved on. Nora bit back a growl. She was the boss here. She got to decide what professionalism meant, and she wasn't going to tackle Julian and ride him until sunrise. She shivered. No, she couldn't think about that. "Estelle, wait!" They still had work to do. Estelle turned around. "What?" "Do we have a head count on Sutton's coven? Their numbers are looking a bit sparse." There should have been 12 witches from that coven. Nora trusted exactly one of them not to be involved in Sutton's scheme, and that was because that witch, Vi, had been vital in taking the woman down. "I'll investigate. One of the cars is gone from the parking lot, and no one has seen Delia Cruz in hours. Might be she took off. I'll see if she's the only one." Estelle left again, and this time Nora let her go. She didn't like the thought of Rosalie's accomplices getting away, but it wasn't her job to chase them down. This was witch business, and she was a shifter. Her senses sparked, and she scented the citrus and fire scent of Julian Frankfurt, before she saw him. He wasn't her anything. Not anything besides a client, at least. And her stupid wolf needed to get a f***ing grip. He didn't carry the same sense of danger like a mantle, unlike some of the other witches at this cursed meeting. He was more healer than killer, but power thrummed under his skin. He was around 6 feet tall, pale, with wavy dark hair, and cheekbones that could cut like a knife. He was on the thin side, built like a runner, with eyes filled with knowledge and power. Nora wanted to know what he could do with that power. She wanted to feel it wrap around her as he sank. She cut those thoughts off with a mental swipe of her claws. Wasn't happening. His dark hair was mussed, and he had shadows under his green eyes. It had been a long night for everyone, and it wasn't close to over. "Will you let me scan you?" he asked, his voice a temptation that wrapped around her and made her want. "I'm fine," Nora insisted. Her bones felt achy, but that came with the territory. There was no reason to think it was related to the magic whammy she'd been hit with. "If whatever Sutton threw at me hasn't killed me yet, do you think it's likely to do so?" Part of being alpha of her small pack meant projecting strength, and shaking off a curse was part of the job. "Please," Julian insisted. He leaned forward, almost touching her. If she felt his hands on her. This kind of attraction was intense. Nora's previous lovers had been fun, but nothing had felt like this, and her wolf whispered what she was afraid to admit. "He's your..." She wasn't going to think that. She didn't have time for a mate, and certainly not this witch. Their lives didn't intersect. She was a shifter. He was a witch. They were part of different worlds. "Quickly," she snapped, and kept her face neutral as he flinched. Better to play heartless bitch than get her heart broken. Julian didn't touch her, and Nora tried to be thankful. He held his hand in front of her chest, and she could feel the heat coming off him, sinking into her. After a minute or so, it dissipated. "What's the verdict?" She didn't let any fear out. She couldn't be scared. Julian's brows drew together, his face scrunched in confusion. "I'm not sure. Whatever Sutton cast on you failed to take hold, but I can sense remnants of her magic in your aura. It may dissipate after a while, or it may strengthen and reignite whatever spell she tried to cast." "Can you give me odds?" She didn't want any magic inside of her, especially not any that came from an evil coven leader who was bent on world domination or whatever. He shook his head. "That would be irresponsible. You should—" "Julian, Audra's looking for you," one of his fellow coven members interrupted them. And Nora hadn't heard her coming since she'd been so focused on Julian. She was off her game. "Go," she told him. "I'll find a witch to check me out if things get worse." He hesitated and opened his mouth as if he was about to say something before closing it and going off with the woman. Nora threw herself into the cleanup work for the rest of the night and fell into bed when she had a moment. In the morning she went to find Julian, but he was already gone. Chapter 2. Julian Frankfurt did his best not to think about the wolf woman. Braided blonde hair, muscles she clearly knew how to use, a pissed-off look on her face, and lips he wanted to... No. He had to put her out of his mind. As the van rattled down a rutted road, he clutched his seat and added more power to the spell holding Rosalie Sutton in her binding. She'd nearly killed them all in a bid for power that would have succeeded if not for the fact that she'd overplayed her own hand. Audra had expected something. That was why she'd hired Nora's crew. But it was one of Rosalie's own witches that figured out the real gambit. He didn't understand that kind of lust for power. He could feel waves of energy all around him. He didn't need to murder people for more. What was the use if it was tainted by suffering and death? Apparently, Sutton didn't care about those things. What had she done to Nora? He thumped his head back against his headrest. There. He'd gone at least 2 minutes without thinking of the shifter. That had to be some kind of record. But right now, he wasn't thinking about how soft her hair might be out of that braid or what she'd look like spread out in his bed. It had nothing to do with it. He was thinking witchy thoughts. It was work-related. And he was the fucking Wizard of Oz. He bit back a groan. He didn't want the others in the van to know what was running through his mind. They were seething with anger at everything Sutton had done and tried to do to them. All he could think about was what it would feel like to bury his head between a sexy shifter's thighs. Thankfully, no one in the van was a natural telepath. The curse. He had to think about the curse. He'd heard the guttural words that Rosalie had spoken as she summoned a wave of power that felt like it could decimate a city. She'd aimed the power straight for Audra, his coven leader, but Nora had jumped in front of it and absorbed the blast. That she hadn't died on impact was surprising. That she was walking around like nothing was wrong was a miracle. She claimed she felt fine, but Julian didn't believe her. A person didn't just shake off that kind of magic. There were spells that affected witches differently than everyone else, so it was possible that whatever she'd been hit with wouldn't do as much damage to a shifter. But it was the difference between being shot or stabbed. She was still injured. She needed help, and said she would get it. Just because a wild flare of attraction had made him go a little crazy, it didn't mean he had the right to rush in and force a healing on her. She was a grown woman. She could call him if she wanted. And he'd made sure to give his card to one of her people. Nora could find him if she wanted. What more could he do? Something deep in his soul was dissatisfied with that answer. He didn't want to wait for her to find him, not when he was meant to. Meant to what? Julian pushed those thoughts deep down into the recesses of his brain. He had bigger issues to deal with than attraction to a wolf. He'd give her time. A little time. But once things with Sutton were taken care of, no power in the universe could stop him from tracking her down. Chapter 3. 1 month later. Nora ignored the stab of pain in her stomach as she bent over to lift up a box of old office equipment. No matter what it felt like, if she looked down, she wouldn't see the handle of a knife protruding from her gut. She was perfectly fine. In great health. Shifters didn't get sick. She clenched her teeth to keep from groaning in pain as she straightened and set the box on her desk. Fuck. Maybe she couldn't get sick, but the curse was one hell of a drug. She placed a hand over the worst knot of pain and pressed. It alleviated the pressure for a moment, and she breathed deep. Getting a lungful of air these days wasn't always pleasant. But she didn't have time to stop. She had a pack to take care of and a business to run. "You doing okay, boss?" Estelle leaned back in her office chair, shoes propped up on her desk and arms crossed, her face carefully neutral. Nora was sick of her carefully neutral. "I'm fine." She jerked her hand away from her abdomen and refused to curl her fingers into a fist. The pain rushed back and she refused to show it. She didn't need Estelle's pity. "You sure you don't want me to call a healer in?" Estelle pressed. She was getting close to insubordination. "You're questioning your alpha?" Before the curse, Nora would have been able to sink a world of menace into those words. Now she almost sounded petulant. "I'm questioning my oldest friend." She swept her shoes off her desk and sprang to her feet. "You're getting worse. 2 weeks ago, you seemed fine. Last week, you stopped being able to hide the pain. Are you going to even be able to stand next week? You were cursed. That's not something you can heal naturally." Nora took another deep breath and let the pain radiating from her abdomen settle. "If it gets bad, I'll get it checked out." She'd been saying that for weeks. She could almost picture the look on Julian's face the first time those words had left her mouth. Estelle didn't let it go. "What's bad? Bleeding from the eyes? Passing out on the job? Losing your ability to shift?" "That's enough." Nora wasn't going to get into this right now. "Shouldn't you be working on something?" "I am." Estelle stared at her, one eyebrow raised, arms still crossed. Right. Nora was the thing she was working on. "You're doing so well. Why don't we spar?" The smart thing to do would be to say no. This wasn't a dominance challenge. She sparred with her people all the damn time. But Estelle was trying to prove a point, and Nora wasn't sure she could win today. But if she said no, she'd validate Estelle's fears. There was no winning. "Get it set up," she said. Estelle's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth as if to say something before snapping it shut and heading for the sparring room. Nora straightened to her full height and sucked in deep breaths. The pain was still there. It hadn't fully gone away in days, but she'd fought 3 enraged shifters after being nearly disemboweled once. Right now, her pain was basically a paper cut. And if she kept telling herself that, maybe her body would start to believe her. Estelle was waiting when Nora entered the room and slipped off her shoes. "Let's keep to human form today," Nora said. "Enrique just buffed out the scratches from our last shifted round." Estelle nodded. Good. Nora wasn't going to shift today, and Estelle wouldn't see her try. Estelle started the timer. They circled one another, looking for weaknesses. 2 months ago, the fight would have already been over. Nora had been stronger and faster than Estelle since they were teenagers and knew her every tell. But today, Nora didn't know how much strength she had, and she wasn't going to waste it on moves that would go nowhere. Estelle knew all of Nora's tells, too. Finally, Estelle charged. Nora let it happen and used the other woman's momentum against her, flipping her over and flattening her back on the mat. Estelle grunted, and it covered Nora's wince as pain ripped through her gut. Stupid curse. She was the boss of her own body. She wasn't about to surrender to this fucking thing. Estelle didn't give up so easily, and she and Nora grappled. It felt like forever, even though the timer was set for 6 minutes. Nora threw every trick she had at the other wolf. She refused to give up, and her pride would not let Estelle pin her. But her body was too weak to let her win. 6 interminable minutes later, the timer buzzed. She and Estelle were locked together, neither dominating the other. Estelle gave up her hold and backed off. "Want me to reset the timer?" she asked. Her cheeks were pink and her breaths came easily. Nora panted, covered in clammy sweat. "Do it!" She wasn't going to throw up. She couldn't. She'd never live it down. Estelle's jaw tightened. "You're really going to kill yourself to prove a point? I can take you." And she would. She was alpha. That was what alphas did to mouthy betas who stuck their snouts in where they didn't belong. "If we go again, we both know I'm going to pin you. Then you're going to get pissy, and what will you do if Enrique and Shannon come back and see? You're sick, Nora. You need a healer. You need to call someone. I'm not going to fight you while you're fucking dying. Take care of it, today, or I'm out." Estelle grabbed a water bottle from the shelf and drank before heading back to the office. Nora tried to follow after her, but the pain in her abdomen spiked, and she doubled over, clutching at her stomach. Okay. Maybe Estelle had a point. Maybe she was being a hard-ass and not listening to reason. She breathed through the pain again and clenched her fists. This time, Estelle wasn't there to see her. When she exited the sparring room, she was alone in the office. Estelle had left a note on her desk, taking the rest of the day off. Beside the note, there was a business card. Julian Frankfurt, Alternative Medicine. She picked it up and tried not to picture his face. Deep, deep, deep inside of her, her wolf roused for a second, picturing the witch as he'd been a month ago. He wasn't like her, wasn't a fighter. He healed people. But he'd run into battle when it counted. He'd saved lives in more ways than one. Could he save her? She wanted to see him almost more than anything in the world, and that was what made her put the business card back down on Estelle's desk. He wasn't the only healer around. Estelle was taking a half day, so Nora would too, and maybe by the time next Monday rolled around, she'd have her head on straight, and this stupid curse would be a thing of the past. Chapter 4. Julian had gone mad. There was no other explanation for why he was walking in a very nice park less than a mile away from his what? His nothing. He hadn't seen Nora in a month. There'd been no word from her or from anyone in her pack. Julian should have left it at that. Instead, he'd put out word with every healer in the region to be on the lookout for a shifter suffering from a nasty curse. He didn't get any replies. No one had treated her. Of course, healers were normally bound by confidentiality. They might not have been human doctors, but they had professional standards. Even if that were the case, one of Julian's contacts would have given him a hint. Was she dead? His heart just about stopped, and he had to suck in ragged breaths to keep from keeling over. She couldn't be dead. His soul wouldn't allow it. Magic churned within him, desperate to be let out, to seek her out and bind her up until he could find her and talk some sense into her. But he was a healer, and he wasn't about to use harmful magic on someone just because he had a nagging sense that something was unfinished between them. If only they'd had time to talk a month ago. Then again, the few conversations they'd had hadn't gone well. Nora had been acting as the bodyguard for his coven, a job she'd taken deadly seriously. She wouldn't bend her professional code for a bit of attraction. The firestorm inside of him was more than a bit of attraction. It was an inferno that threatened to consume him whole. She'd been the only thing he thought about for weeks. Every time he closed his eyes, she was there. Every time he went to sleep, he imagined her in bed beside him. And when he dreamed, he was tangled up in her, taking her body to the heights of pleasure and showing her exactly what a skilled witch could do to a willing partner. And then he would wake alone in his cold bed, hard, aching, and unsatisfied. He should have been over it by now. Instead, he didn't even notice other women. All he could see was how they stacked up to Nora. None of them compared. He had to see her. Hopefully then this madness would disappear and he could find a way to live his life. Or he would find out she was just as obsessed with him and they could burn up together. He knew where she lived. He could go to her apartment right now and find her. If she wasn't there, it would be no trouble to break in and wait for her. He doubted she had any magical safeguards warding her, and locks were no obstacle to magic. Craziness. Julian sank down on a stone bench and cradled his face in his hands. He'd traveled from New York City up to this tiny commuter town nearly 2 hours away. It was the perfect place for a shifter pack. The forest around the place gave them ample room to run. The sane thing to do would be to go back to the train station and pretend he'd never come. No one had to know. If Nora spotted him, she'd know he came for her. How could she not? There wasn't any reason for a lone witch in these parts. This area didn't even have a coven. He could make up some excuse about visiting the alternative medicine practice one town over, but it wouldn't hold. His Nora had a very good bullshit detector. She wasn't his anything. He had to go before he crossed a line. Already this obsession had gone too far, and he feared what would happen if he did see her. He could go home and start a heavy purification and meditation program that would have his mind clear in another month. Whatever he was feeling now would be washed away with all his other worries. But he didn't want to walk away. He didn't want to give these emotions up without at least speaking to Nora. Maybe he was crazy. Maybe he was alone in his obsession. But he'd felt the spark between them, and he just needed 1 minute. If she pushed him away, he'd go. No matter how much it hurt. His phone buzzed. Julian almost ignored it. That was what voicemail was for. But at the last minute, he yanked his phone out of his pocket and answered the unknown number. Hello? If it was a telemarketer, he was going to scream. Julian Frankfurt? A woman's voice asked. She sounded vaguely familiar. Yes? My name is Estelle Wolfe. I work with Nora West. I think she needs help. He shot up off the bench. Where is she? Chapter 5. Silver chains tied Nora down, and the more she struggled, the tighter they became. Her flesh burned under the metal, and she tried to cry out, but her mouth wouldn't open. She couldn't scream, no matter how much pain she was in. Her eyes flashed open, and she saw flickering flames. A witch towered over her, magic circling in a green wave rushing towards Nora. It engulfed her, and the pain of the chains was nothing compared to the icy green fire. As she struggled, she rolled, and the chains somehow grew, binding her even more tightly and searing her naked flesh. Every move she made bound her more, but she couldn't stop struggling. Holding still meant giving in to whatever the witch planned to do to her. If only she could call for help. If only she could scream. If only she could resist. Her wolf was buried deep, but it was fighting against the magic just as hard, and in doing so, it fought against Nora too. She wanted to shift and free the creature, but the silver chains made it impossible. If she got free, she'd kill this witch. No one would even recognize the body. Another wave of evil magic rolled over her, and Nora tasted blood, even though her mouth wasn't there. She was dying. She knew the limits of her body. She could take a lot of damage, but she was at the edge, and there wasn't any help coming. Inside, she wailed. There was nothing she could do. Warm hands clamped on her shoulders, and a flash of bright blue magic nearly blinded her. But suddenly, Nora had a mouth and could suck in deep breaths of air. She opened her eyes, and the evil witch and silver bindings were gone. She was in her apartment, collapsed on her old gray couch, her body covered in sweat, wearing her work clothes but only one shoe, with Julian Frankfurt weaving spells over her head. What? She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and the word was too weak to make much noise. She didn't hurt, and something told her that was bad. Her body had been in a constant state of pain for the last month. For that pain to be suddenly gone, she had to be close to death. Shock. Shifters didn't go into shock. They healed too fast. And yet, at least she wasn't dying alone. Her mate was over her, doing his magic for some reason, his face scrunched up with worry. He said something, but she didn't understand the words. Everything was muted, and the room was darker than it should have been. Julian waved his hands, which glowed with magic, the color growing stronger as his voice droned on. She wanted to know what he was saying, but no matter how hard she focused, she couldn't understand a thing. It didn't matter. She was a shifter, not a witch. She'd never be able to perform spells anyway. Julian reached down and ran his finger down the center of her shirt. Despite the muted pain and the cold of her shock, Nora shivered at his touch. Her body yearned for him, even in her dying moments. She wanted to clutch his hand close to her and absorb the feeling until she stopped breathing. If he could tell what she was feeling, he ignored it. He'd used magic to split her shirt in two, and he spread the sides open, exposing her chest to the cold air of the apartment. His chanting stuttered for a moment, and he cursed. Nora looked down. Bruises blossomed from her abdomen and crawled all over her torso. She didn't know if they spread to her legs or neck, and she didn't have the strength to ask. Julian's magic swelled further, and he flattened his palm on her chest, his thumb resting between her breasts and his fingers over her heart. It burned, and she screamed. And then, in a bright flash, it stopped. Nora froze, afraid that if she moved, the pain would come back, and she'd wake up to find this was all part of an impossible dream. She didn't want it to be a dream. Julian perched on top of her, staring down, his eyes bright, glowing with faint magic that made them appear almost silver. She realized the reason it was dark was that night had fallen, and the curtains were half shut. Her senses hadn't betrayed her that far yet. He was a comfortable weight on her, one she would have welcomed in other circumstances. She welcomed him now. For the first time in a month, she didn't hurt, and it was all due to him. "Am I cured?" Her voice was scratchy and her throat dry, but she didn't move to go get water. Why would she when she could feel the weight of Julian perched on top of her? Julian swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He nodded. He shifted to slide off her, and Nora clamped her hand on his wrist to keep him from moving. If she was at her full strength, she could have whipped him around and changed their positions without breaking a sweat. She was happy to stay where she was, so long as he was right there with her. Julian started to speak. Nora had had enough of words. She slid her free hand up his arm and clamped him on the back of the neck, pulling his face down toward hers. He didn't resist. Their lips met, and whatever tension was left from the curse dissolved, only to be replaced by something hotter. The kiss started off gentle, a brush of the lips that could have been an accident or a thank you. Then Julian's lips teased hers, and Nora's opened for him. Her witch wasn't afraid to take control, and Nora let him lead. What else could she do when he had her pinned and at his mercy? She moaned under him, fire racing through her veins unlike anything the curse had thrown at her. The pleasure was so overwhelming it was almost pain, but Nora didn't shrink from him. She would have torn his clothes off if it didn't mean breaking the kiss. This was the promise of their meeting a month ago. This was what she'd so strongly resisted. She'd been a fool. Fate didn't give second chances. She'd been teetering on the edge of death and still too stubborn to call. But Julian was here now, and Nora wanted to sob at how happy she was. Her wolf was still sleeping inside of her, but today she didn't worry about it. That was a problem for tomorrow. She was kissing her mate. The curse was broken. For the first time in far too long, everything was almost as it should be. Something nagged at the back of Nora's mind, but she ignored it and ran her hand through Julian's hair, the short strands tickling her skin. She nipped at his lip, pulling him even closer. Even in her human form, she was stronger than a normal woman, and she should have been careful. But Julian wasn't complaining. She could kiss him forever. This was what they were meant to be. Ignoring the curse had been stupid. Ignoring her mate? Nora didn't know what had possessed her. The thoughts piled on, one after another, and Nora tried to lose herself in the kiss once more. But all she could think was, mate. Julian. Julian. Mate. She wanted to surrender to it, to let herself be taken by the witch. She'd never felt this way before. It was beyond impossible. She didn't think things like this. It was like someone was rooting around her brain and rewiring her until all that mattered was Julian. She tore herself away from him and glared, "Get out of my f***ing head!" Chapter 6. She arched her hips up and Julian lost his balance, sprawling against the couch and giving Nora enough room to slither out from under him and get her feet under her. Her body felt tight, almost like it did when she went too long between shifting forms, but that never left her feeling empty. She had to tear her gaze away from Julian before she did something stupid like kiss him again. "You're in my head," she accused. Her shirt hung on her in tatters, and she pulled the pieces together to cover herself. Shifters weren't normally body conscious, but her every pore was attuned to this man, and she had to do something. Julian breathed deep, his chest heaving. His eyes still glowed with magic, and even though she knew he was a healer, he looked dangerous. This was the kind of magic that could slay dragons. Or command them. And he was looking at her like he had every right to be there. "I'm not," he said. "I swear it on my honor and my magic." That made her pause. A denial meant nothing. Everyone could lie. But swearing on his magic could have repercussions. "You're doing something to me." She couldn't let it go. His lip curled into a humorless smile. "You're doing the same to me. You know what this is." Mate. The word hung in between them. When she'd been teetering between life and death, there'd been no defense against it. Ever since she first laid eyes on him, Nora's wolf had known what Julian was to her. She wanted to roll around in his scent until it was embedded deep in her skin. She wanted to mark him so everyone knew not to get too close. But her sanity reasserted itself. Julian was a witch. He had a coven and a life away from her. She wasn't about to pack up and move her life for a man she barely knew, no matter how well he kissed. He never asked that. Some buried part of her mind whispered, but Nora quashed it. She didn't have time for a mate. She took another step back, putting space between them. The corner of Julian's mouth quirked up. He knew exactly what she was doing. She rooted herself in place. He wouldn't make her retreat any further. Not even when he stepped forward, close enough that his scent weaved around her, strong enough to enchant a weaker wolf. Nora did her best to ignore it. "You know what this is," Julian insisted. "What did you do to me? To the curse?" When in doubt, go on the offensive. If she kissed Julian again, there was no stopping it. Her clothes would come off, and she'd ride his until they both forgot what it was to be separate. And she didn't want that. For some reason. "Because I have a life and a pack, and I'm not giving it up for some guy." Julian didn't step back, but he did stop looking like he was about to devour her. "I extracted the magic that was choking the life out of you and released it. I'll need to do another scan in a few days to make sure I rooted out the curse, otherwise it will grow back faster than before. Frankly, I don't know how you survived this long. Shifters have innate magic. It's what allows you to shift. That probably gave the curse a bit of a struggle. But you should be dead." Was it wrong that Nora felt a bit proud? She was stronger than the average wolf and had outlasted a curse meant to take out a powerful witch. And then Julian had to keep talking and ruin it. "You're an idiot. You had 2 covens surrounding you the day after you were cursed, and you didn't ask anyone for help. You no doubt had access to healers in your territory. You could have even gone to a human hospital, and they could have given you fluids or something to help your body regenerate to fight the curse. And yet you tried to fight it off like some stubborn wolf with a death wish." "I am a stubborn wolf," she snarled. Her fingers curled, and she wished she could summon her claws. "With a death wish?" They were standing close again, one breath apart. Nora's eyes flicked down to Julian's lips, and she tore her gaze away. "You'll forgive me if I was distrustful of Rosalie Palmer's coven after she cursed me." Standing in place wasn't doing her any good. She walked past Julian and into the kitchen, wincing at the plates in the sink. "Oh well, Julian would have to learn she wasn't the neatest person if he was going to stick around. Which he wasn't, obviously. She pulled a clean glass from the cupboard and filled it with water. "Are you thirsty?" she asked him. It brought him up short, but he took the glass from her and sipped. "Thank you." "You're welcome." She filled another glass for herself. Curse lifting was thirsty work. Julian set the glass down on the counter between them. "You could have come to anyone in my coven," he pointed out. "Audra would have seen you in a heartbeat." Audra was recovering. The witch had nearly died at Rosalie's hand. Her brown skin had been sallow, and she looked like she'd aged a decade in a matter of hours. "You could have come to me." "You were gone!" It came out harsher than she intended, and the glass in her hand shattered. Nora looked down in shock. They both froze, looking at the piece of glass she was still holding. Her strength was returning. The thought broke her out of her trance, and Nora placed the glass on the counter and turned carefully, looking for her broom. "Let me do that," Julian insisted. "You don't have shoes on." "My feet will heal." Glass was nothing compared to enhanced shapeshifter regeneration. "Oh!" Julian threw his hands up. "You do have a death wish, even if you won't acknowledge it. I'm trying to help you, you stubborn wolf. Clearly you can't be trusted with your own well-being. I'm coming back next week to check on the curse. You're going to let me in. I will not let you die. But if I stay here another minute..." He spun around without finishing the thought and marched toward her door. It was for the best. Nora's heart was only beating fast because of the unexpected outburst. It had nothing to do with the emotions he'd raised in her or the thrill of her strength. No, this was fine. She wasn't even going to watch him go. She kept her eyes firmly fixed on the broom and swept the glass into a neat pile. She didn't even step on any of it. So there. A gust of wind blew in, and she snapped her head up. "Close the..." But it wasn't the door. A massive wave of dark magic swirled around Julian, and he met it with a scream. Chapter 7. Anger crashed into Julian and was quickly replaced as he felt the wave of dark magic surging towards Nora's apartment. He was spent. The magic he'd used to heal her had taken him to his limit and left him hanging by a thread. No wonder they'd argued. He had nothing left in him to help him temper his emotions. But as soon as he felt the magic, he opened himself up, tugging at the natural magic that suffused the earth and pulling it into himself. It hurt. The magic was sluggish, viscous, heavy, and unwilling to come his way when he'd already taken so much for Nora. His body was tired and tried to refuse the pull, but his mind was stronger, and his mate was still in danger. It didn't matter that the foolish woman wouldn't acknowledge what was between them. He'd felt every emotion she sank into that kiss, and nothing could make him walk away. He was going to find out what she wanted, what she feared, what was holding her back, and do whatever it took to make her his. But she had to survive first, and the magic heading her way was intent on her destruction. It felt like the curse. Magic carried different flavors. Sometimes it came from the person casting it, sometimes from the type of spell. This was a mix of both. He sensed Rosalie Sutton's magic signature, which must have come from the curse. The witch was locked up in a cell deep in a mountain somewhere and blocked from using any magic. But there was another magic signature mixed with it, one he almost recognized. One of Sutton's accomplices, no doubt. But even stronger than those signatures was the cascade of evil intent to the magic. Magic itself was supposed to be neutral, and it was the caster who shaped it. But this magic had lived inside of Nora for long enough that it had become warped, and once released and allowed to grow in the open, its corruption wanted to spread. If he didn't stop it here, it wasn't only Nora who was in danger. Julian shoved his fears and worries out of his mind. They had no place there, not when he was fighting the kind of magic that could destroy a town if left to run rampant. He'd imprisoned Sutton 5 times over for unleashing this on the world. It felt like knives flowing inside of his veins as he pulled magic to him. He would pay for this, if he survived. He could sense Nora's presence somewhere behind him, but couldn't spare a word for her. She wasn't moving. Good. If she moved, the magic might shift to target her. Right now, he had all of its attention. He directed his magic toward the corruption, circling around it and trying to contain it. If even a speck escaped him, it could grow and return. It would take time, but it would come back. Julian wouldn't allow it. His magic grew, unfolding and spreading, thin as cellophane but strong as iron. He could use some iron right now. Or salt. Something of the earth to contain the mass. Salt! There was a fist of magic clamping his throat nearly shut, but he forced the word out. What? Nora's voice was far away. Salt! Circle! Around darkness! Every word was a mountain of effort. Julian had the magic contained for the moment, but if his control slipped for even a second, it would be over. A salt circle would buy him time. Nora figured it out. She came into his field of vision holding a large box of sea salt and poured it out, giving the magic a wide enough berth that it didn't threaten to touch her. There wasn't quite enough salt, so she dropped to her knees and evened out the circle with her hands. Thin, but enough. Back! He gasped when it was done. She scurried back. The pressure in his head lessened. Salt couldn't hold back magic forever, but the magic had to fight against the salt and him. Julian plucked at the dark magic and sent a strand into the salt, grounding and nullifying the magic's power. Then he took another strand, and another. He slowly winnowed away at the power. His knuckles ached and his fingers felt rubbed raw, but after hundreds, maybe thousands of strands of magic, it appeared the dark power had faded. There was still so much of it. He wanted to slump back, to take a break and strengthen himself before he finished, but he feared if he did that, the magic would find a way to regenerate. He had to finish this now. One strand of magic grounded, then another, and another. 100 more strands, and then another 100. And then nothing. Julian reached for more dark magic to entangle it from the evil wave that threatened his mate, but it was gone. He looked down and saw the salt had turned black, absorbing the corruption as the magic was cleansed. It was done. Nora was safe. For now. Chapter 8. Nora wished she could learn some f***ing magic. She watched as Julian meticulously plucked at the dark wave of evil that whirled around her living room and couldn't help but feel wonder. How was he doing that? The miasma of darkness disappeared as if it had never been there, and she looked down to see that the salt she'd laid had turned black. Was her salt evil now? Was she going to need some sort of magical hazmat to dump it? She'd ask her witch. No, not her witch. Though the longer he stayed in her apartment, the more it felt like he belonged to her. She was going crazy. Julian stumbled, and Nora was across the room in a blink, her arms around him and propping him up. He'd lost color, his normal pale face now ghost white. There was blood around his fingernails, and he was lighter than he should have been. Don't die! The command came out rough, as if she could control magic with only the power of her voice. Inside, her wolf raged. Julian had to be okay. Nora dragged him back to the couch and sat him down. For a moment, he was propped up against the cushions before slumping to his side. But his chest rose and fell. He was sleeping, not dead. Nora considered picking him back up and ushering him into her bedroom. Something about having him in her bed satisfied her on a primal level. Instead, she slid his shoes off and raised his feet onto the couch cushions, laying him out as much as she could without disturbing his sleep. She found a blanket and laid it over him. Then she sat on the ottoman and stared at him, her mind whirring and still caught on what it was like to watch him pour his soul into his magic. She didn't know that much about witches, but she was learning. And Julian hadn't been that powerful a month ago. He'd done something to access more power, had risked something, all to keep her safe. The apartment looked like a tornado had ripped through it. Now would be the perfect time to clean things up, not to mention that cleaning had been one of the last things on her mind in the last month. But Nora stayed where she was. She feared that if she looked away for even a second, Julian's chest would stop rising and falling, his spirit stolen away between one breath and the next. She considered calling Audra Palmer and demanding to know if anything was wrong with Julian, but finding her phone meant getting up from her vigil. What if he died while she was gone? But already her fears were beginning to ease. His ghostly pale skin was now only as white as a sheet of paper. He had dark circles under his eyes, but they were fainter. His body was healing rapidly while he slept. It happened to shapeshifters sometimes. Changing forms too many times in close succession could take a lot of energy out of a person. They passed out and let their bodies fix the damage. It seemed the same thing happened with witches. "I could kill you for scaring me like this," she muttered, and then she reached out and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. Julian squeezed her palm. "If you're going to do it, make it quick." He didn't open his eyes, but his lips murmured the response. She wanted to kiss him. She wanted to lie down next to him, hold him in her arms, and make sure he never did anything that stupid ever again. Her emotions were swinging wildly, and Nora hated it, but she couldn't stop it. "Just get better," she said. She barely recognized her own voice. "I'll be fine by morning. We gotta follow the magic." His grip on her hand loosened as he fell into a deeper sleep. She didn't know what he meant by that, but it sounded like Julian didn't plan to leave anymore. Nora's wolf was satisfied, and she couldn't find it in the human half of herself to push him away. He'd just risked his life for her. He'd saved her life twice over in the span of an hour. Maybe she was better off with him at her side. Nora only realized she was asleep as she started to wake up, the smell of burning sausage assaulting her nose. She cracked her eyes open, surprised to see that she was on the floor, a blanket haphazardly lying across her lap. The couch was empty, which sort of explained the sausage. She climbed to her feet, wincing at the aches in her muscles from sleeping on the hard floor. They'd fade in a minute, but she was too old for camping on hardwood. Julian stood in her kitchen, hand gripping a spatula and a look of intense concentration on his face as he flipped the sausages. She heard the oil in the pan pop, and Julian flinched. "Some mighty warrior you are," she teased. He only wore an undershirt, and she tried not to stare at the defined muscles of his arms. But damn, the man had nice arms. "Fair warning, I'm only wearing boxer briefs," he said, before she fully came around the counter to see for herself. Nora couldn't resist, and his ass was even better than his arms. She had to snap her gaze up before she did something crazy. "I didn't realize this was a pajama party." Julian shrugged and then glared at the pan as more oil popped. "I had to cleanse my clothing of any residual magic. Should have done it as soon as the ritual was over, but I passed out. I'll scan your couch to make sure it's fine after breakfast." He poked his spatula at the pan. "I can smell it from here. The sausage is cooked. You can take it off the heat." She feared it would taste like charcoal. "Are you sure?" He peered at the pan as if it held the secrets of the universe. Nora walked up behind him and careened around to look. "He's dead, Jim." "I'm giving her all she's got, Captain," he responded in a mangled accent that might have been Scottish. She didn't care that he responded with the wrong character. It took all of her resistance not to lean in and kiss him right then. She saw he'd almost made toast and had eggs sitting out. "I'll make the eggs. Put your clothes on. If they're not clean yet, I think Enrique left some sweats here a while ago. They should be sitting on the dryer in the laundry room." "Why is Enrique leaving clothes at your place?" There was a bit of grit to his words, and it made Nora want to shiver. This was nuts. He didn't have the right to be jealous, and she certainly wasn't going to find that hot. Apparently her body didn't get the message. She kissed his cheek, her lips brushing against stubble. "He's a pack member, and my employee. We all keep changes of clothes at each other's houses in case of emergency. That's how packs work." Julian spun around and pinned her against the counter, his arms blocking her in. She could have fought it. In a match of physical strength, Shifter beat Witch. But she didn't want to move. Their eyes locked, and Nora knew he was going to kiss her. She wanted him to kiss her so bad it hurt. She waited there, wondering if he would draw it out or put them both out of their misery. He leaned in, eyes locked on her lips. And then the deafening pulse of the smoke detector nearly made her ears bleed. They broke apart. Nora turned off the heat and covered the smoking sausage with a lid. "Open a window!" She wanted to clamp her hands over her ears and whimper. Smoke detectors weren't kind to shapeshifter senses. Julian was already moving across the room, intent on the nearest window. Nora grabbed the broom from beside the refrigerator and poked at the nearest smoke detector, trying to turn it off. She nearly smashed the thing to smithereens before it finally stopped screeching at them. She and Julian looked at each other for a moment before they both burst out laughing. "Too hot for you?" he asked with a leering grin. She rolled her eyes. "Put your clothes on, lover boy, and stay out of my kitchen." She saved the sausage, though it was pretty far gone. And she didn't burn the eggs. She also put on a pot of coffee. By the time Julian was dressed, something she was determined not to be disappointed about, everything was on plates and ready. They sat at her small kitchen table, their feet not quite brushing. Nora took a valiant bite of the sausage. It could have been worse. "Thank you for making me breakfast," she said. She hadn't realized how hungry she was, but she scarfed it down like she hadn't eaten in months. Then again, she hadn't been eating much over the last month. The curse had caused nausea, and she'd been eating in fits and starts. "Sorry I almost burned down your kitchen." Julian ate slower, savoring every bite. Nora gave up on trying not to stare. Everything about the man fascinated her, and she couldn't stop looking. He didn't seem to mind. When he'd finished half his meal, he brought up the thing he must have been thinking of all night. "I'll take you to Audra. She's a better witch than I'll ever be, and she can make sure the curse is completely gone. More importantly, she might have some insight into that attack last night. I've lifted curses before, and nothing like that has ever happened." "You can talk to Audra all you like. I've got work." And she was already late. The sun was high in the sky, and it was well after 9. Nora didn't sleep that late. But she would give herself a break, considering the situation. "You're not going into work." "You say that like you have a say." "I have to go into work. It's my business." And she'd been slacking for the last month. She had to see how much she'd screwed up and what needed to be fixed. Julian slid her cell phone towards her. "Check your texts." "Were you snooping on my phone? How did you get my password?" The nerve of the witch. "No, I spoke with Estelle while you were asleep. She was the one that called me last night and asked me to check on you. I wanted her to know you were still alive. She said you should take the next week off to recover. She and the others are more than capable of handling things." He was unrepentant in the managing of her life. Nora wanted to be angry, but shame niggled at the edges of her mind. Estelle had been bugging her for weeks to get help, and she'd been too proud to do so. She looked at the text. "Take the week off or I'll challenge you publicly. I want an alpha at full strength." Smiley face emoji. Nora scowled at the message. Was the emoticon really necessary? But she'd pushed her pack to the limit. She needed to be at full strength, and she couldn't bring any more bad magic down on them. "Fine, we'll go see Audra." Julian grinned. "Great." Chapter 9. They'd been on the train for over an hour when Julian spoke. "We need to make a stop before we get to Audra's." "Where?" Nora had a car and she wished they'd taken it, but they would have been caught in a traffic snarl that never ended if they braved the highways. She didn't like going into the city. It wasn't a place meant for wolves. "My place. My clothes were purified, but they're filthy, and I don't want to go before my coven leader looking like this if I can avoid it." He twisted in his seat, and she could see a dark stain on the side of his shirt and a rip under one of the sleeves. "You could have borrowed Enrique's clothing," she said, and had to clamp her mouth shut to keep from grinning when he glared. Jealousy had never been a turn-on before. She'd walked away from more than one guy who thought he had any say over who she interacted with. But when Julian got jealous, it sent a delicious shiver down her spine. There were limits, of course. If he actually said something to Enrique or didn't trust her to be faithful, they would have a heart-to-heart. But knowing she caused that visceral reaction in him, that was powerful. Had she decided to keep him? Inside of her, her wolf was adamant that she should. The human part of her still wasn't so sure. The train ride was a reminder that Julian's life was in the city. She wasn't about to uproot her pack just to be closer to him. One kiss, and that was what she was thinking? She was going crazy. You know it's more than a kiss. "You all right?" Julian asked. He patted her leg, and she covered his hand with her own. "Fine," she responded. No need for him to deal with her crazy. A few stops later, Julian got up and Nora followed. Once they got off the train, he headed for the station exit. "We could transfer to another train and get a bit closer to my place, but it's only a 20-minute walk." "My legs could do with a stretch." The streets weren't crowded in this part of the Bronx, and Nora could almost enjoy it. But cars and trains rumbled on the streets, and her senses were under attack. Give her the forest any day. Julian lived on the 3rd floor of an old brick building whose hallways smelled like pot. "The college kids 2 doors down seem to have an endless supply of weed," he explained. "And Doritos." Nora wrinkled her nose. City scents. Really, she could do without them. Julian unlocked the door and led her in. The place was neat as a pin, and tiny as one too. It was a studio, and his bed took up a good portion of the room. He had a small desk in one corner of the room, with 2 computer monitors and a stack of books that looked likely to topple over. His kitchen was against one wall and was much neater than hers. But in a place this small, a person had to be neat, or an avalanche of stuff would bury them. The smell of pot had faded, and in the room all she smelled was Julian. If she had a bit less discipline, she'd roll around his bed and bury herself in his scent. She might not have liked the city, but there was something undeniably special about being in her mate's private place. Julian opened a small closet and pulled out 3 changes of clothes and a small backpack. He was planning to come back with her. Nora could protest. She could tell him that their time together ended once they were done talking to Audra. Julian would say the clothes were a precaution, just in case he had to come with her, just in case she needed more magical protection. She could argue. She liked arguing with him. But she wanted him back in her place. She wanted him to lie in her bed and cover it with his scent. It was a primal urge, and she was sick of resisting it. Let him come back with her. Maybe if she gave in to the madness, she would work it out of her system. Her wolf snorted. Yeah, that never worked. But it wouldn't hurt to try. She could heal from a broken heart. If she never tasted him, she'd regret it forever. Julian pulled off his shirt, and she must have made a noise. He froze and looked her way. "I can change in the bathroom," he offered. Nora stalked towards him and plucked his shirt out of his hands, throwing it towards the bed. "No need." He watched her, seeing what she would do. Nora let instinct guide her. This might be her only time in Julian's private space, and she wanted him to remember her every second he was here. They didn't have much time. Audra was expecting them. But the coven leader could wait a little longer. Nora weaved her fingers through Julian's hair and pulled him close, sealing their mouths together and moaning as she tasted him. The day before, the kiss had been pure madness, and she couldn't remember it as well as she wanted to. This time, though? This time she was making a memory that she'd savor forever. She opened her mouth, and Julian's tongue surged in, tangling with hers. His hands landed on her hips, pulling her closer. She moved with him and found her back pressed against the wall, Julian's body caging her. It was the kind of aggressive, dominant shit she'd never put up with from another shifter. But from her witch, bring it on. Her body lit up, pleasure zinging through her at the rightness of the kiss. And each press of his lips, each sweep of his tongue made her want more. Time and responsibility lost its meaning while he held her. The loud sounds of the city outside faded, and they might as well have been in their own little world. Julian fit his knee between her thighs, and Nora moaned again. She pressed herself against him, trying to eke out every bit of pleasure she could from this moment. His skin was warm against hers, and she wanted to pull off her top and see what he would do if they were both shirtless, but she'd have to stop kissing him to do that. She was never going to stop kissing him. His lips feathered along her jaw and down her neck, teeth teasing her with the hint of a love bite that would show everyone what she and Julian were doing. She arched her neck back, giving him better access. She wanted him to bite down hard and leave a permanent mark so everyone would know. They could stay in this apartment forever. The bed was only 2 feet away, and now the tiny size was an asset. They'd rarely have to ever move from the bed, and she'd be able to keep her eyes on him wherever he went. Nora's wolf wanted it. The woman wanted it too. All they had to do was stumble back. But Julian pulled away. His lips were red and swollen from the kiss, his eyes dark, and there was something determined, almost predatory in his gaze. "This isn't over," he promised. Nora shivered. "You're confident." He grinned. "I am." Then he stepped back and picked up the clean shirt he'd dropped, pulling it back on. He shoved the rest of his clothes in a bag and slung them over his shoulder. "Come on, we have to go." Chapter 10. Audra's building had an elevator, and it smelled like an idealized version of a forest. Nora didn't know how they did it. Usually, artificial fragrances had a nasty chemical scent that couldn't be disguised, but not this one. The halls were wide and brightly lit, with warm colors making the place feel like home. Audra lived on the 8th floor, and she answered when Julian knocked, greeting them with a smile that quickly turned grim. "Come in," she said, waving towards the interior. The apartment was huge by New York standards, and Nora shuddered to imagine the price tag. There was an office right beside the front door, and she spotted a kitchen down the hall, as well as a formal dining room. There had to be more, but the rest of the doors were closed. Audra was an older black woman, somewhere between 50 and 70, who wouldn't have been out of place at a hippie reunion. She liked long, flowy dresses, kept her hair long enough to fall below her shoulders, and usually wore a serene expression that made her seem timeless and wise. Today, she wasn't serene. She ushered them into the sitting room and pointed at 2 chairs, then sat opposite them on a small couch. She didn't offer drinks. This wasn't a social call. Good. Nora wanted answers quickly so she could leave the city and its chaos behind. "What have you brought me, Julian?" Audra asked, eyes flicking up and down as she took Nora in. Nora felt a bit like she was under a microscope. She didn't like it. Julian explained the curse and the attack of dark magic. He talked about magic in ways she'd never heard before, discussing power vectors and dark matrices. He made magic sound like math. Yikes. But Audra nodded along. Julian didn't mention the kisses. That was for the best. Audra didn't need to know about their relationship. Not that they had a relationship. Nora's wolf scoffed at her. She wasn't fooling herself. When Julian was done talking, Audra looked at her again. "May I hold your hand and do a magic scan?" she asked. Nora reached out her arm, scooting to the edge of her seat to reach over the small coffee table between them. Audra's fingers barely touched her skin, and Nora felt a zap, like static electricity, but judging by the way her hand and Audra's fingers glowed, it was magic. The fizzy, not electricity swam through her veins, making her want to shiver and pull away. But Nora held still. Julian's magic didn't feel so intrusive, but she didn't want to think too hard about why that was. After about 5 minutes, Audra pulled back. That wasn't a good hum. "What's the verdict?" Nora didn't dare a glance at Julian. She had no idea what her face would show, and she didn't want to reveal anything the coven leader didn't already know. "Inconclusive." Nora stood and went to the bookcase along one of the walls, plucking up what turned out to be a leather-bound journal. She set it on the table and pulled out a pen, making some notes. "Would you say you've been fatigued in the last month?" Fatigue didn't even begin to cover it. "Yes." "Julian?" Audra prompted, not looking up from her journal. "What?" He jolted in his seat. "Would you say you've been fatigued in the last month?" Nora went on alert. She stared at Julian and wondered what he would say. She didn't have to wait long. "Yes," he admitted. "A bit." "And has there been any fluctuation in your magic, specifically since Nora was cursed?" "Yes," he said again. "I've had 2 healings fail and a spell backfire on me. Very unusual." Audra scribbled more and then closed the journal and looked up. "The nascent mate bond between you saved your life," she told Nora. "And you're lucky the bond isn't complete yet. Otherwise, the curse may have been able to do more damage to Julian. As it was, you were taking some of his energy and sustaining yourself. It's the only reason you're still alive. That curse should have killed you in a week, 2 at the most." "We're not," Audra interrupted. "I know you're not about to make some foolish denial. I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. This isn't the first curse I've seen." Nora choked the denial back. There it was, the thing she'd been trying to ignore since she'd first set eyes on Julian. He was her mate, and apparently he'd saved her life just by existing. Nora kept quiet. She couldn't deny what Audra said, but Audra didn't know the whole picture. She didn't know the reason why Nora couldn't be Julian's mate, not fully. "There's still a link between you and whoever is sustaining this curse," Audra said. "It's how the magic returned after Julian healed you. Until you sever the bond between yourself and that witch, you can expect more attacks." "Do you know how to find the other witch, or how to sever the bond?" Julian asked. Audra gave him a soft smile. "Unfortunately not. But I have resources and I intend to find out. Stay close to one another for the time being and give me a few days. I suspect the person controlling the curse will need a little time to recover from yesterday's antics. I will call you as soon as I know anything." They left the apartment and headed back towards the train, wordlessly agreeing to go back to Nora's apartment. Nora's mind whirled with everything Audra said, but she sat quietly next to Julian as the train rolled on. Was this nightmare ever going to end? Chapter 11. Her apartment was just as they'd left it. Julian placed his bag on the couch and Nora busied herself in the kitchen, making a pot of coffee. The place still smelled a bit like burned sausage, and she tried not to smile. She'd have to teach him how to cook if he was going to stick around. The ghost of a smile left her face. He couldn't. He had a life back in the city. And she wasn't fit to be anyone's mate. Julian was standing in the living room, looking out the windows when she came out of the kitchen. "Coffee will be ready in a few minutes," she said. "Thanks." They stood in silence. Her apartment overlooked the town square. At first she'd wanted something on the edge of town, near the forest, someplace half wild and ready for a wolf. Then she'd seen this apartment and fallen in love at first sight. The town was small and quiet enough that it didn't bother her wolf, but noisy enough that she never felt like she was alone in the world. The human part of her needed that. "You've barely said a word since we left Audra's," Julian said after a while. "I'm not sure what to say." She stared out the window. She feared if she looked at him, she might scream. Not at him, but at the situation. "Audra is the wisest witch I know. She'll solve this thing, and I'll keep you safe from any magical threat until then." "What about your life in the city? Don't you have an alternative medicine practice?" She'd seen his business card. Alternative medicine was what a lot of magical healers claimed to do, though they swam in a sea of human charlatans and placebos. He nodded towards his bag. "My practice is mostly online. I consult my patients and prepare poultices and potions which I can mail to them." "You mail magic spells to people?" It sounded ridiculous. "Well," he explained with a sarcastic smile, "we don't actually have owls that deliver messages." Nora laughed, imagining Julian covered in feathers, half a dozen owls perching on his arms as he tried to attach packages and messages to their feet. "Yeah, maybe that's a bit too complicated." He turned to her and pinned her with his gaze. Now Nora understood what her prey felt like. "What are you really thinking about?" She didn't want to have this discussion. She didn't want to reveal the fear that was buried deep inside of her. She didn't want Julian to know. "Audra said that we're mates. Were you going to say anything?" "You already knew." It wasn't a question. He may have never used the word, but this kind of bond was no secret in the supernatural world. He felt it just as strongly as she did. He had to. "Already knew what? That I dream of you every night? Sometimes I wake up, sure you're going to be right next to me, even though before yesterday we'd barely spent time together. Or that I have nightmares of you being torn apart by a curse and I'm not there in time to save you. Do I know that my heart sings for joy whenever I'm near you and that my magic goes crazy? Or do I know that you've been rejecting me since the moment we felt this thing between us?" His gaze was hard and each question battered her. "What do you want me to say?" Nora was out at sea. Her body was still recovering from the curse, and some growing part of her just wanted Julian to wrap her up in his arms and tell her everything would be all right. She kept forgetting why she wasn't supposed to do that. "I want to know why you don't want this. Is it because I'm a witch? Or because I'm a healer and not a combat witch?" "It's because I'm broken." The admission tore out of her, and Nora had to back up a step. She had to move or she would explode. What? Julian stepped closer, but stopped when she put her hands up, as if she'd push him away. Nora hadn't told anyone. The shame, the loss of it was too much to bear, and she couldn't stand the thought of being pitied. But now that the confession was started, she couldn't stop speaking. I haven't been able to shift since I was cursed. I can feel my wolf inside of me, but she's trapped, and she's growing weaker every day. One day I'm going to wake up, and she won't be there at all. I've never been alone like that. I can't be someone's mate. I can't protect my pack or anyone. I refuse to bring someone down with me. Now Julian did step close, and his arms went around her. The curse weakened you, but it's gone now. Your wolf will come back. And if it doesn't, the fear that the curse could be lifted and her wolf would still be lost from her was what had truly kept Nora from seeking help. It was better to die than be left with only half of herself. It will, Julian promised. He squeezed her even tighter and brushed his lips against her forehead. And if it doesn't come back on its own, I'll comb every magical text there is until we have an answer. And if we don't find one there, we'll make one of your pack members bite you. You'll be a wolf again, one way or another. What if none of that works? Trying to fix the problem was scarier than living with it. She could deal with hopelessness. Hope, though, there was nothing more terrifying. Then you'll live as a human, and I'll be here with you, if you'll have me. You've seen my magic. I may be a healer, but I can protect myself. I don't need a protector. I want a mate. His scent engulfed her, and it would be so easy to give in. She'd be taking all she wanted and betting that it would all turn out just fine. I can't make that kind of decision right now. I'm not... I want you, he interrupted. Do you want me? She could equivocate. She could lie. But in his arms, the truth was right there. Yes. He smiled, and despite her terror at the future, Nora felt lighter. That's all that matters. We can figure out the rest later, okay? Why did it feel like she was standing at the edge of a cliff? But she only had one answer to give. Okay. He kissed her. Chapter 12. Nora's wolf wanted to howl in joy at the touch of his lips to hers. This was what was meant to be between them, not tension and rejection, never fear. She and Julian could face any threat the world threw at them, so long as they did it together. Her body yearned for him, hot and tight and desperate to get out of the stupid clothes that confined her. She wanted to pull him down to the ground right there and have her way with him. Twice. But she had a nice bed, only a few steps away, and a couch even closer. Nora didn't move, not when she could indulge in the feel of Julian's tongue claiming her. Damn, the man knew how to kiss. Why hadn't they been kissing all day? Her fingers quested under his shirt until she found skin, and he gasped against her mouth as she ran her nails over his sensitive back. Not hard enough to mark, but a promise of things to come. Of everything to come. But just feeling his skin wasn't enough, not when she wanted to kiss every inch of it until she had memorized him, and then do it another time just to be sure. It had been so long since she let herself go, and she knew it would be different, better with Julian. Already his kisses drove her mad. What would she do when she was on the bed and completely at his mercy? She couldn't wait to find out. She was an alpha wolf, a predator's predator, but a part of her wanted to submit to her mate, just like another part couldn't wait for him to submit to her. Both of them equal. They stumbled away from the window, clothes flying everywhere. A mental picture of the room gave Nora the warning she needed to jerk Julian to the side before they stumbled onto her coffee table and broke their toes. Fuck it, the bed was too far. He pulled back and she tried to follow, but Julian pinned her to the couch with a hand on her chest and a hot look in his eyes as he sank to his knees on the floor in front of her, his lips twisted up into a seductive grin. Yes? He asked, the fingers on one hand teasing her upper thigh, not quite touching her where she wanted, but ratcheting up the anticipation. Yes. She was riveted as he leaned closer, kissing her thighs and taking his time. She was ready to jump off that ledge of pleasure when her mate proved just how evil he truly was, pulling back just before she'd had too much and letting her body cool off. She would have cursed him if she had the breath. Instead, she was mortified to whimper. He took mercy, or began his torture anew, and as she writhed under his tongue and his fingers, she wanted to beg him to let her come, and to never let this end. But she clamped her mouth shut. He'd gotten his whimper, but she wouldn't break. She'd been trained for physical torture, and though pleasure washed over her, she knew she could handle this. Julian sensed the change in her and pulled back just enough, eyebrows raised. "That's your game?" he asked. "I'll never break." "You'll beg me for more," he taunted. Her witch wanted to play. She glanced at the clock on the table beside him. "You have until the church bell chimes the hour. Then it's my turn." 7 minutes. She could survive 7 minutes. No time to waste. There was a spark in his eye, and Nora immediately realized she might have miscalculated, and she was ready to suffer for her mistake. Magic flicked up her sides, invisible bonds holding her in place as Julian unleashed himself on her. There was no holding back anymore, and she loved it. Nora wanted more. She struggled against the magic bonds, but only because she wanted to touch him. Julian held her even tighter, and she realized that unless she called this whole thing off, she was going to have to sit there and take it. She took it. She forgot about the challenge and everything except the feel of Julian's fingers and his tongue and his magic supporting it all. She'd never known a witch would use magic in a carnal setting, but she wanted to see what else he could do. In the distance, she heard a bell tolling as her body gave up the fight with pleasure, and she surrendered to it, crying out and shivering as she came. The magic bonds dissolved, but Nora didn't want to move. Julian looked smug, and he'd earned it, but it reminded her of the challenge, and she found the motivation she needed to remember how to move. "You like that?" He grinned. She leaned down, used all of her strength, and hauled him up to the couch, switching their positions. "My turn." She sank to her knees in front of him and looked up, their eyes locked. It was her turn to make him scream. Chapter 13. Julian was in the bedroom doing something witchy, and Nora felt like her skin was too small to contain her. At another time, on another day, she would have shifted forms and ran as a wolf to blow off some steam. But right now, she was stuck in her stupid human skin with no hope of relief. Would she ever run as a wolf again? Julian seemed optimistic, but he didn't know what it felt like. She tried to explain it to him after they were done trading orgasms. He'd almost seemed to get it when she said it would be like if he were cut off from all magic. And still he insisted she'd get better. It had been a month. She'd never gone that long without shifting. Babies shifted within days of their births. She was less of a shifter than a baby. Maybe she needed to talk to someone in her pack. They might understand. But the thought of revealing her fears to them made her sweat. No, not yet. Maybe Julian was right, and once she healed completely from the curse, all would be well. She had to hope that was true. She wasn't sure how she could go on if she wasn't a shifter any longer. She paced back and forth in the living room. Was something making noise? She paused and listened. She could hear Julian moving around in her bedroom and smell the faint scent of herbs, but it wasn't him. No, it was like the annoying buzzing of a trapped bug or electricity. It wasn't the TV, and she didn't see any bugs. The longer she stood still, the louder the buzzing got. She paced again, and the annoying sound lessened, but it didn't go away. Great, now she was getting migraines. Shifters didn't get migraines. She needed out of the apartment. Nora looked at the door and then glanced back to her room. Julian wouldn't like it. She was facing a witchy problem, and it was foolish to walk away from a magic user. But the park was just outside, so it wasn't like she was going far. She patted her pocket to make sure she had her phone. Yes, she did. She would berate a client who pulled a stunt like this, but she wasn't Julian's client, and she was going to crawl out of her skin if she didn't get some fresh air. The buzzing in her head got worse. Nora scribbled a note on a piece of paper and left it on the counter for Julian. He'd know she was just outside, and she'd text him if anything witchy happened. The buzzing subsided a bit as she walked out the door and down the stairs. Nora's muscles relaxed and she breathed in deep. She could smell the greenery of the park and the surrounding forest, even though it was corrupted by the smell of cars and asphalt. Better than New York City, definitely. The park beside her house was big, with tree-lined paths, 2 large play areas, and 2 baseball diamonds. She could walk there for hours. She didn't have a destination in mind, but that didn't matter. It wasn't like she could get lost. She just walked. Under other circumstances, she might have run, but she hadn't bothered to change into running clothes, and her shoes weren't right for the kind of running she'd like to do. Maybe tomorrow. The buzzing in her head subsided to a tiny chirp of annoyance that she could ignore. Apparently, it had been her body's way of telling her to stop being so cooped up. She was no longer weak from the curse, so it was time to enjoy her life again. The path she was on made a half-mile circle around part of the park and brought her back to the entrance closest to her apartment, and as she got close, she saw Julian sitting quietly on the bench, looking down at his phone. The asshole had followed her. Nora scowled and stepped off the path before he could see her, cutting across to a different path that wouldn't cross in front of his bench. If she walked by him, they might argue, and it was far too nice a day for yelling. The new path wasn't covered with asphalt, and her feet sank into the soft grass. Definitely the right choice. She needed the earth under her feet. Nora headed for the far side of the park, away from Julian and the few other people taking advantage of the sunny afternoon. Something in the back of her mind nagged at her, telling her this was a bad idea, but it was like her feet had a mind of their own and she had to move. Under other circumstances, she might have worried that some outside force was messing with her. But Julian wasn't far away. He had magic senses and could tell if there was danger. Right? Nora put it out of her mind. Rosalie Sutton was in a magical prison deep in a mountain somewhere. She couldn't get to her. And as for her accomplice, well, Nora wasn't sure where they were, and right now, she didn't care. The buzzing came back. Nora ducked between 2 trees and stopped. The sun suddenly disappeared, and it looked like a storm was about to roll in, but the atmosphere didn't feel any different. She looked back where she'd come, and the path was gone. A large bush was right behind her where the path should have been, its branches so dense that she couldn't see through them back to the park. Something was wrong. Nora reached for her phone to call Julian. This was witchy business, and she needed his help. Hopefully someone was just fucking with her, trying to make her lose her way. But she had a feeling she was about to meet one of Sutton's accomplices. She'd pulled up the contact and was about to call when a jolt of magic hit her in the chest, and she dropped the phone. Nora tried to scream, but something clamped down on her throat, cutting off all sound. Nora sank to her knees and tried to keep her wits about her. She couldn't panic. Panic would get her dead. Where was her phone? She strained to reach for it, but it was a few feet away, and the magic force holding her was too strong for her to fight. No matter how much she strained, she couldn't reach an inch. A woman stepped into the dim clearing. She was short, with dark hair and dark eyes, and wore a simple outfit of jeans and a black t-shirt. Magic crackled all around her, power greater than she'd shown a month ago. Nora recognized this woman. She was one of the witches from Rosalie Sutton's coven, one of the witches who had run away after her capture. Delia Cruz. The name came to her as the witch threw a bolt of power her way. She couldn't move to dodge. It slammed into her chest and Nora gasped in pain. Magic sunk into her, burrowing into her soul and finding the pathways that had been carved out by the curse. Nora couldn't reach her phone. She was too far away for Julian to hear her scream. But there was the nascent connection of the mate bond holding them together. Nora pushed the pain aside. It wouldn't do her any good. Easier said than done. The pain was a living thing. Her bones felt like they were on fire and being crushed at the same time. She felt a wet trickle on her ear and wondered if she was bleeding. What could this magic do to her? Witches rarely killed directly with their power. It had consequences, but Delia didn't seem to care about that right now. Nora redoubled her effort, pushing the pain aside and focusing on Julian, a bright, shining beacon of hope buried deep in her mind. She hoped he could feel the bond between them. Audra said it was there. When Nora let herself be vulnerable, she could almost feel their hearts connected. But the bond wasn't complete. If they survived this, she'd fully bond with him the second she was healed. She wasn't letting anything get between them. Another wave of magic and pain washed over her, easier to ignore this time since she was so deep in her own soul. Nora gathered all the power she could and focused on that beacon, sending the cry for help with everything she had. "Julian!" Chapter 14. Julian jolted off the bench as Nora's cry ripped through his head. He took off running before he could think of his direction. He didn't need to think. The call came from deeper in the park, and that was where he was going. Pain, anguish, they sank into him, but they weren't his own. Someone was hurting Nora. In the apartment, they'd been safe from detection after he'd warded the place against outside interference. He would have told that to Nora if she hadn't snuck off on her own, but there was no time to dwell on that now. Julian called magic to him, opening his senses up to the world around him. His battle magic skills were limited, but he packed a hell of a punch, and he would make whoever was trying to harm his mate pay. If he could find them. He slowed down as the call weakened, but the bond holding him to Nora was still there. But where was she? He was no longer on the paved path, and the woods around the grass walkway were dense, denser than they should have been. Magical fury. Julian sent out a pulse of magic. It could warn whoever was hurting Nora that he was coming, but he didn't care. He was mad enough that he didn't need the element of surprise. The bushes beside him glowed with magic, and Julian plowed into them, sending a burst of magic ahead of him to break through the barrier. Beyond the bushes it was dim, the sun barely a suggestion. But he could see well enough. A witch blasted her power at Nora, who had sunk to her knees, her teeth bared in pain and threat. Julian recognized Delia Cruz from the incident with Sutton's coven 1 month before, so this was one of the accomplices. She was going to rot in prison forever, if he didn't kill her for harming his mate. Julian sent a blast of power at Delia and welcomed the aftershock that came from using magic offensively. The whip of pain focused him and startled out a laugh as Delia stumbled back. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded as she got her feet back under her and refocused her power. She sent a wave of it at Nora to keep her in place. "Are you the moron who broke the curse?" Nothing moronic about it, but Julian kept it to himself. She wanted to taunt him into verbally sparring so he lost his grip on magic. But he was better than that. His magic was a fine-tuned instrument that could root cancers out of the body with a single burst of power. He could deal with this woman in his sleep. He couldn't free the bond from Nora without taking his focus off Delia, but he sent a burst of magic her way to hopefully shield her from any pain Delia tried to cause. His mate was strong, even if she wasn't a witch. Maybe she could break the spell herself. He hoped so. Delia changed tacks. "What kind of healer knows these spells? You're doing harm." Julian sent another wave of magic at her, but she was ready and blocked it. Her words didn't do anything to his emotions, but what she was doing to Nora threatened his sanity. And she'd figure it out sooner or later, so he had to stop her before she turned her attention back to his mate. Rather than hit her straight on again, Julian sent his magic through the earth, a shock wave causing the ground to rumble and trip her up. Delia fell, and his magic was on her, binding her wrists and ankles with invisible cuffs. But he wasn't fast enough. She got one of her wrists free and used her magic to pick up a fallen tree branch and swing it at him. He dived to the ground to dodge it, and a whip of her power waited, lashing him across the face and opening a cut on his cheek. She'd pay for that. He was stronger than her, but she was more skilled at offensive magic. Julian's only shot was to overpower her quickly, and if he failed, he'd tire himself out and she'd be able to defeat him with a single blow. But he wasn't just fighting to save himself. He could see Nora struggling against the magic that held her. She was going to get loose, and when she was, Delia couldn't effectively fight them both. Julian called as much magic as he could and sent it back to Delia. His bindings held one of her hands and one of her ankles. She'd managed to free one ankle while lashing out at him. He grabbed the ankle with his power and held it, sinking everything he had into holding her there. The roots of the plants around them were his friends, and Julian called to them, urging them to shift and grow and move to encircle Delia's wrists. The roots absorbed his magic like they'd been made to do so, and though Delia struggled, she couldn't get free. Julian let some of the magic go, returning it back to the earth. Then he stumbled back to Nora and freed her from Delia's enchantment. She threw her arms around him and kissed him like she thought they were both going to die. "You heard me. I'll always come, he promised. Delia made a disgusted sound from where she was bound in the roots, and they both glared at her. What do we do about her? Nora asked. She glared at the witch with a wolfish gleam in her eye. A dark part of Julian whispered that no one had to come. They could end Delia here and now and claim it was self-defense. He could even free her from her bonds and let her charge at them. She'd be dead before she realized it. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. She's going into the mountains in a cell not far from her former coven leader. She'll face a tribunal and answer for her crimes. He stepped back, and a branch from one of the trees overhead snapped, crashing down on him and making him lose his grip on his phone. Pain flashed through him, and he heard another snap, but he couldn't see anything. Nora cried out, and then he heard ripping cloth and snarling. Delia screamed, her voice a lot closer than it should have been. Then the screaming stopped. A wolf howled. Chapter 15. Nora only realized what had happened when she felt Julian's hand in her fur. She was in her wolf form. She was a wolf. She would have pranced if Delia's body wasn't under her paws. She wanted to run and celebrate. After a month without feeling her second skin, it felt like a dam had burst and suddenly all was right in the world again. Nora backed away from Delia and forced herself to calm down. She had a duty right now, and she couldn't do it on 4 legs. It will be all right, she promised herself. Now that she'd felt her wolf, she knew she could shift back. Whatever had been blocking her was gone. She surrendered her wolf and felt her body shift, muscles and bones realigning until she stood on 2 feet, completely naked and a little cold. She picked up her t-shirt and pulled it on. It was a bit torn, but it covered most of her important parts. Another woman might have felt guilt at what she'd done to Delia. Nora had been protecting her mate. Killing a threat was her duty. But she was wary of looking at Julian. He'd gone to great effort to tie the witch up. What if he didn't feel the same way? When she finally looked at him, there was no fear or shame in his eyes. He understood just as well as she did that some things had to be done. I'll call in the authorities, he said. They'll want to autopsy her to make sure she's not hiding any secrets. It was self-defense. When he said the authorities, she knew he meant magical authorities, not the human cops, but the defense still leapt from her mouth. They're going to want to see our memories. That should clear everything up. Can you consent to that? He looked truly curious. Nora wondered what he would do if she said no. Would Julian go to war with the witch police for her? But she forced herself to nod. If that's what it takes. He made the call, and she expected to wait for a while. She plucked her torn pants from the ground and pulled them on. They didn't look great, but at least she wasn't naked. Around her pack, she wouldn't have cared. Around magical cops who could try to drag her away in chains, Nora wanted clothes on. Her shoes and underwear hadn't made it through the transformation. There were clumps of rubber and scraps of torn fabric around her. Oh well. Shift happened. They'd been waiting in the clearing for only 5 minutes or so when reality split in front of her. A white line seemingly cut in the air ripped open, allowing 4 people in business attire and an additional 4 people in what appeared to be human CSI gear to step through. Julian straightened as one of the people in business clothes greeted him. The man was in his 30s or 40s, wearing a gray suit over his slim body, a large woman with curly red hair beside him. The other 2 suited people came her way, 2 men, one 2 inches shorter than her, with medium brown skin and closely cropped black hair, the other with darker brown skin and green hair. The green hair was unexpected. My name is Ezekiel O'Malley, the first man said to her. He nodded toward his green-haired companion. This is Freddie Garner. We're with the Arcane Investigation Unit. Delia Cruz has been a fugitive from our unit for a month. Would you allow me to view your memory of the event with a simple incantation? If all is well, we'll be able to release you without any further delay. What went unspoken was that if all didn't go well, they'd be hauling her off to witch jail. But Nora knew what happened, and there was no use fighting the authorities right now, especially not when there were 8 of them and only her and Julian to defend themselves. Have at it. Ezekiel nodded, but it was Frank who approached her, chanting too quietly for her to pick up on the words. He placed his hand on her temple, and flashes of the last hour whizzed behind her, too fast for her emotions to catch up. It was dizzying, but over almost as soon as it started. Frank's hand seemed to glow with her memory, and he said another quiet incantation before shaking Ezekiel's hand. Both of their hands glowed as they viewed the memory. After a few more minutes, Ezekiel nodded. He seemed to come back to reality. "Thank you for your cooperation. AIU will get in touch if we need more. You're free to go." Well, that was easier than dealing with human cops. Nora backed up and found Julian waiting for her at the edge of the clearing. "All set?" she asked. He nodded. "Let's go home." She took his hand and led him out of the park. Chapter 16. When they made it back to her apartment, Nora noticed that Julian had begun to limp. Even worse, there was blood on his arm. "What the hell? Why didn't you tell me you were hurt?" Nora rushed him to the couch and sat him down. "Stay there. I'm getting the first aid kit." As a shifter, she didn't need a first aid kit, but she'd done a few jobs with witches and a couple with humans and seen what kind of damage they could take. After a particularly gnarly job, she'd purchased a first aid kit for her home, just in case. Julian waited for her. "It will heal quickly," he promised. "As soon as my power regenerates, I can do a healing spell and be good as new." "What do you mean?" She knelt on the floor and had him take off his shirt. He winced as the fabric tore away from the wound. Nora grabbed gauze and saline. "I mean, it took a lot of magic to stop Delia. My powers need a few hours to recover. I'll be fine." He was looking at her as if she was the one that was injured, the one that needed comforting. Nora scowled. She was perfectly fine. Better than fine. She had her wolf back. She was whole again. It was her stupid mate who thought it was okay to get hurt fighting an evil witch. Stupid, stupid mate. Julian winced, and Nora realized she might have been cleaning his wound a bit thoroughly. She pulled back, wiping gently until she was satisfied his wound was clean before applying a bandage. There was a cut on his face, but it didn't seem too bad. It wasn't bleeding. "Do you want me to take care of that one?" she asked. "It's fine." Julian covered her hand with his and pulled her up onto the couch to sit beside him. "I'm fine. These wounds aren't life-threatening. They're just an annoyance." She didn't think he was lying to her, but she still worried. Humans seemed to die from the smallest of issues. Touch their intestines even a little and they were done for. Not that Julian was human, and his intestines were fine. But the point stood. "Should we call in a healer?" she asked. "Or Audra?" His coven leader could be at the apartment in a few hours. A healer could be there sooner. Nora's hand itched to reach for a phone. "I'm fine," her mate insisted. "If I get any worse, we can call in someone. But believe me, all of this is minor." It might have been minor to him, but she wanted to wrap him up and keep him safe, to make it so he never felt another wince of pain. "You should lie down. Rest while you recuperate." She was hovering, and the look on Julian's face told her he thought the same. "Is this what it's going to be like every time I get a paper cut? I'm not fragile, you know." Her heart skipped at the thought they might have a future beyond today, and while he'd been teasing her, she couldn't tease back. "You have a life in New York." He found her hand and laced their fingers together. He tugged on her until she was sitting beside him, their bodies cuddled together. "I told you, my practice is mostly online. Yes, I have friends and family in the city, and the city is still not far away. My mate is here, and I couldn't ask a wolf to come to a place as busy as New York." He paused. "I'm sorry, I'm moving too fast. I'm making assumptions." But Nora's heart wanted to burst with joy, and her wolf was howling so loudly within her she was surprised Julian couldn't hear. "It's not too fast." "It's not?" He leaned in close and she mirrored the movement. "You're my mate." Then they were kissing, and worries about Julian's injuries fled Nora's mind. He was a big boy. He'd tell her if it hurt. They fell back on the couch, bodies entwined and room to maneuver greatly reduced. There was fumbling and more kissing. Her shirt was half hanging off of her, and her hand was in Julian's pants when they both went crashing to the floor. Their eyes met, and they burst out laughing. They were alive. They were together. This kind of joy didn't come often, and Nora wanted to hold it close and trap it so she'd feel this way always. Maybe with her mate at her side, she would. Julian leaned in and arched his head until his neck was bared for her. "Do it," he gritted out, voice tight with pleasure. Nora didn't need to be asked twice. Shifters couldn't normally change their human bodies, but when the claiming instinct rode them, it was impossible to resist. Nora's incisors grew until they were practically fangs, and she bit down on Julian until she tasted blood. A pulse of magic hit her in the chest, her witch's own way of claiming her. Then he was crying out, his body releasing as her own orgasm took her. He collapsed beside her, his arms slung over her chest, his weight welcome. He was breathing hard. So was she. "Give me a minute," he panted. "Totally ready for round 2. Nora lay back, unable to stop the smile that spread on her face. Chapter 17. The train ride into the city was just as bad as the last time Nora took it. Okay, not quite as bad. This time, Julian held her hand the entire way and whispered filthy promises in her ear whenever she got distracted or began to get overstimulated. Of course, being horny on public transport was its own kind of torture. She almost made her mate detour back to his apartment before they went to their intended destination. But no, she'd be good. She and her mate had spent the entire weekend in bed except for a couple of phone calls they'd been forced to make to prove to everyone that they weren't dead. Nora would be going back to work shortly, and Julian would begin his move out of the city. It felt a little crazy. She and Julian had been a thing for 2 days, and already he was uprooting his life for her. But that was what mating was. She'd known wolves who'd changed the entire course of their lives just because of a glance. There was even a legend about an ancient war that ended because the mating bond bloomed between the leaders of the opposing forces. A 2-hour train ride to New York was nothing compared to that. And now that she'd let herself commit to the bond, she had no idea why she'd ever resisted it in the first place. Were she and Julian moving fast? Sure, maybe by human standards. But he was a grown-up. He would tell her if he needed something. He squeezed her hand when they came to their stop, and they walked the distance to Audra's apartment in companionable silence. Her mate didn't need to fill every second with talk, and she enjoyed that, just as she enjoyed talking with him for hours. It was a heady time as their bond settled into place between them. Things would calm down, she was sure. But that didn't need to happen yet. Audra greeted them with a smile and invited them in. There was tea waiting on the coffee table, and Nora and Julian sat next to one another on Audra's couch, their thighs pressed together. Audra didn't try to hide her grin. "So, is this why you waited to make your report?" It was teasing more than censure. Julian was unrepentant. "You knew it would happen." "I was wondering if—" She trailed off and shook her head. "Never mind, that's unkind. Would you like to hear what the investigation has uncovered so far?" Nora leaned forward. "They told you?" "I am the injured party. Of course I was informed." Nora wasn't an expert investigator, but she was almost certain that didn't sound right. Audra was connected. She had friends in the AIU, but Nora wasn't complaining. She wanted to know. "It appears Delia Cruz has been hiding out with a distant cousin ever since the unpleasantness a month ago. Her magic was traced to a small town in Pennsylvania, and her cousin confessed to harboring her. The cousin didn't know what Cruz was involved in. Another co-conspirator, Katrina Stevens, is still on the run. All of her distant relatives are accounted for, so she doesn't seem to be hiding out with any of them. An investigation of Cruz's apartment turned up some documentation about her collusion with Rosalie Sutton. They've been siphoning power from witches for more than 3 years, and they weren't working alone. There's no reason to believe we're in any direct danger, but this isn't over. Watch your backs." Nora didn't like the sound of that. She clutched Julian's hand to convince herself he was right there with her, safe and sound. There were no evil witches lurking in Audra's apartment, and she wouldn't let any of them touch her mate. They had another cup of tea with Audra and discussed people that Nora didn't know. But someday all these names would be familiar to her as her and Julian's lives intertwined. They could face the dangers, but what she looked most forward to were these quiet moments, these reminders that they had something real together. They bid Audra farewell after another hour and ended up back at Julian's apartment, where he packed a bigger bag. Nora sat on his bed and watched him. "My lease is up in 2 months," he said as he stuffed clothes into a suitcase. "That gives us plenty of time." "So why are you rushing to pack?" she asked with a grin. Julian finally looked over to her and noticed she'd unbuttoned her shirt and was laying on display for him. He made a sound that went straight to her core. She grinned. "Come here. We have time." Her mate pounced, and Nora held him close. If this was how she was going to spend her time in the city, it wasn't that bad after all. Thank you for listening. For more audiobooks by Kate Rudolph, please visit katerudolph.net. This has been Wolf Cursed by Kate Rudolph, a Guarded by the Shifter novella. Narrated by Maxx Pinkins.